An open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. It's the 17th of January 2015. This is UCY.TV with the Solvinur Event. We're going to play the last two parts of the interview with John Taylor Gatto. It's a bit more than 2 hours, so we'll miss the last part of part number 5. But let's see what we can do here, right? Here we go.
Clear. All right. First, I would like to present you with a book. Not that you don't have enough books, but this particular book was written by a friend of Thomas Becket, and he wrote it for Thomas Becket. For Thomas Becket didn't have, in this author's opinion, enough intellectual self-defense to do what he was doing, and he was trying to help him out. And his name is John of Salisbury, and it was written in the 12th century. And I thought, if there was such a thing as reincarnation, this guy reminds me of you, and that you would greatly enjoy this.
I will read it with pleasure.
12th century defense of logic and reason in a time of irrationality. And I took the liberty of, just in the prologue, I marked a couple pages there that has there's a couple quotes in there where he basically lays out why he's doing it. I thought, I got a chuckle out of it, and I thought you could always use a good laugh now and then.
This will be the very next thing I read.
All right, now I have one last bit of housekeeping. Let me see. If you could read that to the camera while, at the same time, holding this mug, and it'll be the intro for the episode. Or you can change it however you like.
Give me the I sign. Hi, I'm John Taylor Gatto, and this is What You've Been Missing.
Awesome. Yesterday, the name of R. Gordon Wasson came up, and you raised your eyebrows. What does that name mean to you?
Well, it means to me soma, the magic mushroom, and that Wasson wasn't some fringe nut, but some Wall Street heavy hitter. So I read it with great pleasure, not once, but until it fell apart.
Before you leave today, I have a DVD for you. I just have to burn it. I have the folder made and everything. And in there, I put Wasson's Russia, Mushrooms, and History book, which is very hard to find on PDF. So I just thought you'd get a kick out of it.
I will get a big kick out of it.
What does the name Anthony Sutton mean to you?
Actually, I corresponded briefly with Sutton. He made the contact after he read Underground History. And his books about the rise of Wall Street and the rise of the Soviet Union and Wall Street and the rise of Nazism were important parts in a slow process of overcoming my own skepticism. I mean, I had all the pieces, or I had many of the pieces, rather, but they seemed to add up to a reality that I could find no hint of recognition of. And in the copious reading I had done and kept current, why weren't there any references to this at all. Or occasionally when someone like Ramsey Clark would seem to breach the wall of security, Ramsey was toast. He was marginalized. No one ever mentioned Ramsey again. He wasn't a guest on any show.
Well, the same thing happened to Sutton, because he worked for the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, which is very prestigious. And then once they started reading his work, they're like, you can't write this. And he said, that's the ticket out of here. I must go find out what's going on. And I think he wrote like nine or more books on these various subjects. And when you see how Wall Street funded the Bolsheviks, and Wall Street was funding the Nazis and the Bushes and the Harrimans and all those families that were also eugenicists, and the ones that want to do compulsory schooling and tell you what to do with your kids and all these other things. Like, there's a very small knit group, and once you try to understand the philosophy of what makes them the utopians that are trying to shape everyone else's lives and violate their volition, I thought it was like it's overwhelming to discover that. But then you discover someone like Lysander Spooner or Bastiat, Frederick Bastiat, and read the book The Law, and it's so simple, and yet if you don't understand the simplicity, it's easy for these other groups to take it away from us.
Yes. Very easy to marginalize as who has time for this nonsense. I mentioned in our session yesterday that as I was poking around for other reasons in the history of American adoption, I kept running into the people who were the architects of American schooling. And I said, what possible correspondence? The chapter in Underground History, Daughters of the Barons of Runnymede, is actually a kind of lens into my brain trying to prove to myself there was some sense in following this road. If the heirs of the people who fought at Runnymede had maintained an 850-year continuity, and then I found other organizations that had, I said it's possible that someone with an agenda other than this. So,
who was Ignatius Loyola?
Well, Loyola was the founder of the Army of Jesus, the Jesuits, who penetrated the Reformation and eventually produced the phenomenon history records as the Counter-Reformation. They slowed the momentum down because the Reformation really is founded, although Calvin is the eminence grise, Luther's every man his own priest is this wild declaration of radicalism. To get rid of the religious priesthood is to get rid of all middlemen, yes.
There were many countries that outlawed the Jesuits in the late 1700s, and one of those was the province or electorate of Bavaria. And then there was a Jesuit professor of canon law named Adam Weishaupt who created a group. And what influence specifically has that group had on the education system?
Well, to pursue that line would require so many illusions. I prefer not to enter an area where I can't field the hardest questions with substantive facts, but certainly the sense of powers behind the scenes very, very strong. Let me give you a few specifics. It's been clear since the beginning of standardized testing that the tests do not predict. And the best American, the most prestigious American universities have either dismissed it or kept it in pro forma place. But actually, as Harvard and Princeton told me, it's not a significant determinant. They just don't want to rock the boat, the glue that holds this pyramid together. They don't predict. And why is 10% of the school year and school budget devoted to exerting stress on so many millions of people and through the children, their families? And why do so many innocently ignorant school teachers say this will determine your future, when it only does if you convince yourself that it determines your future? It has no predictive power at all, other than to signal this is someone who will memorize whatever you ask him to memorize. This is a useful skill, an anti-skill.
In the book, the Leipzig Connection, Basics in Education, toward the end of the book, after talking about Pestalozzi, it talks about Pestalozzi's mentor, who was Johann Caspar Lavater, who was working and experimenting on Swiss lower privileged children in a universal schooling system. He was also a Grand Master of the Illuminati. So since Pestalozzi and Lavater and all these other key figures that were in the Prussian education system were also members of the Prussian Illuminati, it just seemed natural to see the takeover and undermining of nationhood of our society, the taking away of our identity through the school system, is also making we as a nation incoherent. And it just seems like there is a very militaristic strategy that's been in place a long time.
And notice what the specific mechanism is. It's an artificial extension of childhood, theoretically to the grave, but certainly beyond the point where learning anything is easy. As long as you indulge childish fears and childish appetites long enough, you've effectively rendered somebody harmless. You can see it in its crudest form in the military, in the training of recruits, or in fraternities, in the hazing of freshmen. But actually, yesterday I hope we talked about Richard Branson and the turning point of his life at age 4, when his mother drops him miles from home. Throughout most of human history, anywhere on the planet, childhood is over by the age of 7, and even in the most permissive cultures, it's over by the age of 11 or 12. People are, even in our own country, at the beginning of the 20th century, a substantial number of young women at the age of 13 were married or becoming married. I'm thinking in particular of I'm thinking of a 18-volume history of the world that used to be for 20 years the premium of Book of the Month Club, written by a husband and wife team. And still, a rather respectable history. Inside historians say it's not bad history. It's very, very...
They also do a history of philosophy set?
Yes.
I have it. Gene O'Denning just sent it to me last week. I just scanned it in. It's on my desk if you want to go get it. There's like...
All we need is the last name, and I'll trigger it. And in any case, the fellow who had been trained, I think, at Chicago as a historian, marries his wife, who becomes his co-writer, and
Will Durant
and Ariel. Ariel was either 13 or 15. There's a dispute on the internet about how old. She wasn't older than 15, and I suspect she was 13 when they married. Was Will some form of sexual oppressor? No. Instead of going to junior high school, Ariel studied professional historiography and its protocols, and she was a full partner in the writing, and Will died, predeceased her 10 years, and she continued to lecture, having begun her productive life when people began their productive lives. To extend this to the late teens or beyond the late teens is to fly in the face of the first admiral in American history being in charge of a warship.
Farragut
at the age of 12. Or George Washington being the surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia in his mid-teens.
Very entrepreneurial attitudes that they
Or
got.
Jefferson running a plantation, his parents both dead, 250 employees. He's 12 or 13. But these examples go on and on and on. Why have we marginalized the young who, whatever they lack in experience, more than make up for in resilience, in acuity? They bring new eyes to old situations, which is the secret of scientific invention. So it's done because they're the most dangerous. They're the least overlaid with these conditioning and of course, that must have been understood way, way back in history. Alexander the Great, after all.
You're observing that values has changed since the time of our founding fathers, who were literate, autonomous, entrepreneurial. They also grew hemp. They knew the value of hemp.
Oh, my. George wrote he did it for medicinal purposes, so I assume it wasn't.
And Jefferson traveled the planet collecting different strains, and they had contests, and they wrote letters about their, hey, I grown this strain, and it does this, and they're like competing. And so the fact that you're not taught about this in school, and the role that hemp played in making the sales and the clothing and everything was hemp dependent.
Oh, it's a miraculous fiber. There are some rather sober accounts of the lengths to which the Hearst family went because they were the largest forest owners in the country. They supplied the wood pulp for newspapers, but hemp newspapers are infinitely superior to wood pulp, so that they moved heaven and earth to create the narrative of reefer madness.
So if we're using wood pulp paper to make books these days, we're not only killing trees, which eat CO2 and produce oxygen to make paper towels and toilet paper and all these other things beyond books, but I noticed that a lot of the books that are printed recently, the pages are disintegrating. And when you get old books from the 1800s, 1700s that are printed on hemp paper, they're still pretty, existent. We have a Johnson's Dictionary from 1848. And it's not printed on the same wood pulp acid, paper that we have today. So can you comment on, they undermine education, but they're also undermining just our ability to get our hands on the books to educate ourselves, closing libraries and using types of paper that, basically turn to dust.
Oh, yes. And there's been, since I've been in college in the 50s, there's been a prevailing wise guy ethic that you don't actually need to read these old books because there are plenty of abstracts, digests of these old books in existence, and that will give you the guts of the old book. Well, let's take Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. What the digests don't give you is the wealthiest, most powerful man in the world. I mean, I don't know if that confluence has ever existed after Aurelius, saying that nothing you can buy is worth having, and nobody you can order around with your power is worth associating with. That's a rather acid.
So how old were you when you first met Marcus Aurelius?
I was initially in translation in 6th grade in a coal mining town in western Pennsylvania, where it was offered in translation, and of course it's eminently readable. And then in 9th grade, there was an option of reading it in Latin or doing something else. So my mother insisted that I read it, Julius Caesar in Latin, Gallias omnes tuis and partes tres at 75, Quorum unum in colon Belgia. We had to memorize the early part of it. But Caesar's Gallic Wars isn't some old piece of fustian that, you know, if you're an elitist, you read to plug into the ancient world. It establishes the principle that a weaker force can whip a larger force by dividing.
And being better prepared.
Yeah. You can set the larger force against one another. And you see that in schooling, the ordinary classes are set against one another by constant, meaningless testing and small, inconsequential prizes being given to the people who test best and wiggle their hands in the air, so that the ordinary classes are divided for a period of 12 years through meaningless competition. I noticed when I was in basic training in the Army and was told that I was going to learn in 3 hours how to take a rifle with 57 parts of blindfold and put it back together. I knew that I could not do that. I knew I could not do that. And yet, in a room with 500 other scared young people, we all did it. And they didn't say, and he finished first. You know, the important thing is, what do we learn that's enhanced by competition? I mean, what real do we learn? It gets in the way because now your rank becomes a factor rather than the quality of what you've learned. I made these ideas clear to 13-year-olds at all times and found that after about 90 days, they became as addicted to ideas and the whys of things as I was. Whenever a new idea would emerge in the classroom, this is quite literally true, I would grab a piece of chalk and write it on the wall. I'd climb a ladder and write it on the ceiling. Inside of that first 90 days, there were hundreds of digests of ideas everywhere, on the floors when there was no room left, front, back, sides of the room. I had world maps and national maps, and I could leap up and point to the origin of the idea as we know it, or simultaneously they came. As I say, it was roughly 90 days when classes that were considered the stupidest, people who'd never eaten off a tablecloth in their life, were actually, they were hot to talk about ideas. We couldn't have that. How could we maintain the social order and the economic order if we had people who became fully alive when they were young and could get up when they're knocked down? You know, I think a lot of the problem, it's very easy to assign this completely to sinister motives, and there are certainly sinister motives at work, but I think part of it is the problem of how we would manage a society that didn't require managing. And I don't think anyone's been able to solve that problem. The early America probably did it better than anyone we have easy access to.
Because I think it's not about anarchy. Anarchy is just a void or a vacuum of government. It's about being autonomous. And if you take away the government, it doesn't automatically give people critical thinking or the self-reliance that they need and the compassionate communication that they need to work together with other people to achieve goals.
Right.
So, in your explanation of how you learned the most powerful lesson of doing the impossible, you knew you couldn't do that, And after an hour or so, you had just done something that you knew you couldn't do.
I knew I couldn't do it.
You took that experience and you taught younger people that they can do that, because now they have more years. You had to be at least 18 to be in the Army. Now you're teaching 13-year-olds that the things that you know you can't do, you don't really know that.
Right.
And you need to get that up here first.
Right.
So the question that I would follow up with is, in your third interview on Gnostic Media with Jan Irvin, I heard you mention these words, trivium and quadrivium, and I thought it maybe is something that was off your radar, but you spoke eloquently about it. And so where do you have familiarity with the trivium and quadrivium, and what does it mean to you?
I went to Jesuit boarding school in third grade, so I'm between the ages of 7.5 and 8.5 years old. And the curriculum, reflecting back on it, which I first began to do 15, 20 years ago, the intellectual diet was not modified in any way for our tender years. And the devices of discipline and motivation that would be used in an authoritarian world they were not chary of using, but I do believe that their hearts were in the right place. I remember being humiliated. I told you privately about this yesterday, by a Jesuit brother from St. Vincent's College, which is across the street from Xavier Academy, where I went and was beaten on a daily basis by the Ursuline nuns, sometimes for mispronouncing French there. But the brother was talking to us in the middle of the Second World War about the causes of the First World War. And he had written a list of causes on the board. I had a magnificent memory before drink intervened. And he said, could somebody face the back of the room now and tell us all the causes? And I, with my memory, I did, word for word. And he burst into harsh kind of laughter, and he said, you fool, you believed me. He erased the board and said, these are the causes of the war. Now could you do it? And now, chastened, I did, a lot less confidently. And this time, the room exploded with his scorn. He did it again. He erased the board. He said, you will never know the causes until you embed yourself into the primary documents and see how complicated a thing this is. That changed my life. I only wish I might have had a second year there, but
before you can form your logical understanding, he said you need to get in check with the knowledge, the actual grammar. What are the artifacts?
Yeah.
Where do these things documented? What's primary sources?
And it probably has occurred to other groups, but the intellectual part of the universal Christian religion, the Catholic Church, had a respect for scholarship. And what happens as you collect data is that it forms itself into patterns. And if you record the patterns and test them to see that they hold true, eventually that suggests behaviors. So that they created two formulae, a basic formula which Dorothy Sayers, and I'd urge all your listeners to read her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. She's a marvelous detective story writer, and the detective stories really aren't genre stories. They're a comedy of manners about the British upper classes, but the trivium was becoming comfortable with a pattern of thinking in which you could dispel confusion. And then the quadrivium was pushing it farther into specialized areas. One of the huge mistakes that schooling makes, even homeschooling, is to organize the agenda and the goals in terms of subject learnings: English, math, social studies, science, because those categories, while better than chaos, are so crude they tend to mask what you're actually after. Take the universal study of the English language. What you're after is a mastery of the written language, the spoken language, and your own writing. So you've got these three divisions, and now if you're after those things, your measurement's not through memory, it's through performance, which is so much more accurate. As we spoke about a little earlier in this session, the standardized tests aren't predictive, and every first-class university knows that. You don't select people because they scored here on the SATs or whatever other tests are administered, because they end up disappointing you. And you waste people who actually...
In real life, we don't use standardized tests to make decisions, whereas you actually do use the trivium to observe, to process that information, and to make informed decisions.
Right. And while there are personal variants, so I think the fundamental thing, as every philosopher in human history has said, is know yourself. This is the fundament. Now you can take principles like trivium and quadrivium, and you can do a personal adaptation of them. You know how they will work for you. But the course I actually followed at the beginning was to say, I know this is not good for the kids I've been hired to teach. And where will I find an unerring structure? I said, obviously it will be in the most expensive elite private boarding schools. So I made a 10-year study, although it paid off at the end of the first year, and I distilled the boarding school curriculum of power. Now I'm talking about not private schools versus public schools at all, because most private schools follow the template that public schools laid down. I'm talking about the inner circle, 20 or so. Let me just name a few of them. I'm talking about Groton, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt emerged. I'm talking about St. Paul's, where the senator from Massachusetts who ran for president, the tall, skinny guy, John Kerry, emerged. I'm talking about Andover, where the Bush family went. I'm talking about Choate, where John F. Kennedy emerged. I'm talking about one that not one person in 10,000 has ever heard of, Episcopal in Virginia, where John McCain, the populist, give me a break, emerged. I learned about Episcopal from the sports section of a newspaper. I'm looking for the next Pittsburgh Pirate defeat, and suddenly I see a tiny item that says at the homecoming football game for Episcopal Prep School in Virginia, 25,000 alumni showed up. I said, wait, it's got to be a misprint. I mean, I can understand 25,000 people came from all over the world for a high school alumni game. So now I start to look and I discover that Episcopal, it's the naked revelation of the importance of religious tradition in upscale education. Over half of the elite boarding schools in the country, and all of the inner circle ones are grounded on religion, almost all on the Anglican religion, which isn't faith-based. It was put together by committees arguing about what must have been in God's mind. but also there's a respectable number that are Quaker-based. Now here we're talking about a tiny fraction of the population, no more than 100,000 people. It's produced in the 20th century 2 presidents. How is that even possible? Statistically, what would a bookie say the odds of this little splinter group, who we all are taught are innocent and unworldly and pious? Well, so anyway, so I got the 12. So I'd like to, if possible, go through a few of these because I adapted them instantly to Harlem kids and almost immediately began to produce results. It was roughly 90 days because at first Harlem kids don't believe that anything useful to them is going to happen in a school. But after about 90 days, these kids start winning competitions with the inner circle kids of the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Instead of being amazed and wondered about, I'm called in and accused of child abuse. What on earth are these people doing? You must have written that for, I said, I will confess, I corrected the spelling and the punctuation, but that steel trap set of ideas proving the case is not mine. I'm not up to that standard there. So I began to get hot water ever since. Let me share a few of these. We all are vaguely aware that literacy is at the heart of an intellectual inner life. But what we don't understand is that prior to the First World War, literacy commonly was divided into passive literacy, reading, and active literacy, speaking and writing. And none of us are aware that in colonial days, to teach active literacy to ordinary people was a crime. Why? Because reading, you're locked in your own head, and you still have the benefit of being able to read the boss's instructions about what to do. But if you can speak well, as our current president can, or write well, you can reach way beyond your own skull and recruit allies. That's a no-no for ordinary people. They're supposed to be so inarticulate, or their writing will look so funny with ink blots and things in it that no one treats them seriously. So strong competencies in the active literacies are at the core of elite private boarding schools like Groton, St. Paul's, Choate, Lawrenceville, Gunnery, Hotchkiss. And each one of those schools, by the way, has some legendary tycoon as a patron, or sometimes more than one. Canton, Connecticut is J.P. Morgan's baby. So, and this is in no particular order. Insight into all institutional forms. You're supposed to know the logic, the steps that we arrived at a prison system or a library system or all the other, the military system, obviously. Third, here's a secret. Some of your listeners, watchers, viewers will be school teachers. And if you teach history or literature, you will run into a great deal of difficulty moving kids. But if you approach those subjects and share this with the kids, that what we're after here is not a good story or memorizing details from Jane Austen for the test. We're after a theory of human nature. And anyone who's written a book that lasts more than their own time has spent years closely observing people in interaction, and the trace left behind is an insight that you might spend a lifetime and never have. So that's what we're after, a theory of human nature drawn from history or philosophy or literature or law, or the greatest trove that's unexamined is theology. I used to go to auctions, and there'd be boxes of religious books, 50 cents or $1 from a century ago, and nobody wanted them at auctions. But I bought them because they were cheap, and one day I have a barn in upstate New York. I picked one up idly, and I was in the hands of an intense thinker who was drawing on all history and philosophy to create an insight into human nature there. And I said, interesting that theology is something that we don't regard at all if we're ordinary people. So a few other of the secrets of the boarding school curriculum of power. Mastery of the social forms. And I would say it didn't take more than 2 days to take kids who had never eaten off a tablecloth and get them to see that the signs they give off when there's an egg spilled on the shirt, or when they walk down the street listening to the radio, or when they're too aggressive in approaching somebody, shuts off opportunity. They're like little badges that I don't want to speak to that person. And a lot of what we consider as racial or ethnic prejudice is simply that the disguise of these social forms is unknown to the person who then is discriminated against. And I said, don't believe me. I said, I'm going to instruct you in a superficial gloss of how to approach people. And then the intellectual excuse we'll use is I'm sending you out of school for days to gather data for statistical processing. We're going to test the local comparison with what the New York Times says the nation is thinking. And I'll teach you the elementary statistics in one class session that you need. And it's a legitimate project. But meanwhile, you don't want to approach somebody and have them jump back or say, if you don't get away from me, I'll call the police. And that's what you think will happen because of the overt racial prejudice on the liberal west side of Manhattan. But it won't happen, I guarantee. Nor did it. The transition, I won't say it was 100%, but it surely was 80% simply from having a gloss on these social forms. And then this should tickle people watching this segment. Then suddenly I saw that the rules of access to the great institutions of New York City by young people, which required, let's say at the Sub-Treasury building where the gold is kept down in Wall Street, one teacher for every 5 students. Well, a public school class of 30 students, you're not going to muster 6 teachers. But I said to the kids, how do they know you're not a teacher? Well, we're only 13. Nobody knows that. They know it because you're chewing gum with your mouth open. They know it because you're scratching your head. They know it because you slouch. They know it because you giggle. They know it because you carry a notebook that falls on the ground every few minutes and paper goes everywhere. Why don't we master what a college student, who could be a student teacher, what signs they would give off? They'd carry a clipboard. They'd cock it at an arrogant angle on their hip. They would be slightly nasty and taking attendance every few minutes, or saying, when your mother hears about this, Jack, I said, let's see if we can pick 5 people out of this class and penetrate security at the sub-treasury building, at the mayor's office, anywhere. We were never caught. Not once. Now, the Bronx Zoo says 1 for every 15 kids. But how are you going to even get 2 teachers to take kids to the Bronx Zoo? Well, it's easy if the kids can shift from being 13 to being arrogant college student teachers. Never caught in 8 years of doing this.
Well, that's real self-esteem. It gives them real confidence from experience. And to be able to go into Columbia, sit in the back of a class, and see what college is like before you have to go to college takes away a lot of anxiety.
Now, I don't know why you said that, but okay. We were only 20 blocks from Columbia, and I have a degree from Columbia, so I understood that the law school classes there are 300 people in these banks of seats, and the only way, no one takes attendance there. Your grades on the test are evidence of whether you've been attending or not. But if you sit there slouch and pulling gum out of your mouth, yeah, someone will say, who are you? Never caught once. So our age, this artificial extension of childhood that we talked about at the beginning of this particular session, is a secret of crowd control where people become their own prisoners by adopting the cultural signs that they're immature or they're not of our group, and simply by seeing these things as languages. There isn't one English language. There are 10 that are modified according to the, and someone like Obama, how? I'm not sure. They understand this and they can shift effortlessly from one idiom to another. And I would say that to the kids. I would say, look, here's why you're reading English poetry. Now, there are a lot of reasons, but here's why we're doing it. You're going to find that the ordinary unit of meaning in the English language is 3 hard stresses long, or sometimes 4, but often it's 2, 3, or 4. But as you enter the realm of intellect and you have more to say or more nuances to say, you need larger units of meaning. 5, that's iambic pentameter. Even 6, that's hexameters. There, the Greeks used 7 septameters, and I want you to feel that, and you'll feel it by reading and memorizing some of this poetry. You'll have the models built into your head to shift back and forth according to your audience there. Shakespeare, to the ignorant, writes iambic pentameter lines. And one of the reasons you don't want to even look at Shakespeare is all the lines seem to be pretty much the same length. But I'm going to teach you something that he knew 4 centuries ago. It looks like they're all the same length, but there's a breath pause in this speech after 2 heartbeats. The next breath pause is 12 before you've delivered your meaning. 3, 4. There's this inner jazz at work underneath this regular pattern. You can learn to do that. Once someone exposes the secret to you, that's half the game. And the other half of the game is simply building the models into yourself so you don't have to think, now here. And yet we used an exercise that, if I tell you, immediately turned horribly dull writers into at least modestly interesting writers, and it's totally mathematical. I said it'll take you a while to incorporate what I just said. So what I'm going to ask you to do is write 1 to 20 on 20 pieces of paper, put them in some sort of container, and draw them out at random, and then list what you've drawn out at random and now I said, now you're going home, not for homework, but to learn this massive skill, and you're going to write a paper on X subject, and if 1 is the first number that came out, the first sentence will be 1 word long, 1 beat long, and if the second one's 20, it'll be 20 long. Immediately, these remember, I had to read 120 of these things at a time, and one of the reasons they were horrible is everyone had either a 3 or a 4 unit or a mixture in there. Now they had the kind of jazz that readers aren't completely conscious of, but they record as something interesting about, even when he's writing about a milk separator. And you as a filmmaker, remember Eisenstein's film of the peasants watching milk being separated on a Russian farm in the 1920s. Why is it so awfully interesting? Because he understood things, that the eye is looking at the movement of light around the screen. It's looking at entrances and exits. 13-year-old kids from Harlem can master these secrets just as well as 25-year-old Harvard students can. And then they become preternaturally sophisticated. What on earth? How do you know these things? Because they're our birthright. We're biologically equipped to learn this way, unless somebody sticks their oar in and intervenes and says, read Jack London and memorize.
We've all heard about the hard way to learn, John. Is there an easy way to learn?
If you begin and understand yourself thoroughly and you have a lot of raw experience, I think natural powers are released. And I do believe that all the graceful, easy learning comes from people who are comfortable inside their own skin because they understand. And people who've had a lot of early experience. And I operated on those principles even though it was illegal in a public school setting. I set aside 1 full day a week. I won't get into the politics of how this was pulled off, but it was never easy, where the kids could follow their own instincts anywhere in New York City they wanted to go. 1 full day a week where I took them on group projects, different parts of the 5 boroughs of New York City, group projects that would end up with a tangible goal, such as testing. I remember this one might amuse the people watching this. The New York Times announced on the front page about 3 weeks before the Ed Koch, Dave Dinkins election of, let me say 1980, somewhere around there, that Dinkins was hopelessly behind by 17 points. And I had a black kid in the class come up and ask me why the city was so prejudiced. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, look at this. And I said, well, why do you believe that's true? Maybe that's to get you not to go and vote. I don't know, I said, but I do know that it says here in small print that they only interviewed 300 people. And there's 8 million of us. I said, there's 120 people in my 5 classes. If each one of you do 20 interviews, and we do it according to the way you get a random distribution, and that's easy enough to find out, well, we can have many times larger sample than. So that happened. We gathered the data. We processed it. And we discovered, about a week after the Times said he hopefully was behind, that he actually was ahead by a fraction of 1 point. It's quite a skew. The election came. He won in the closest race in New York history. But notice that a random group of 120 13-year-olds had produced more accurate information. The math in the statistical processing is hardly daunting for a 5th grader. You know, so why aren't the 70 million captive school children involved in, if nothing else, data gathering, since obviously it's a crucial part of commerce? You know, opinion. Well, there must be a reason they're not used that way, nor do they hear about statistical sampling until they're in college, for the most part. Why not? According to Alfred North Whitehead, one of the major mathematicians of the 20th century, other than addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, the only crucial piece of math for everyone to learn is statistical sampling predictions, because the society, the economy is organized around those things. The politics is organized around those things. He said that in Aims of Education, which I think was published in the mid-1940s. Well, you know, 60 years have gone by, and where is it? He's hardly a radical.
Is it possible to train fleas before you break their will? And what can one learn from the gene sequencing hobbies of 11-year-olds?
I got a foundation award at a fancy hotel in Washington, D.C., I guess about 15 years ago. It was certainly a while ago. And sitting next to me was an 11-year-old boy receiving the same award from the foundation. And, I mean, I was tickled. Here's this little skinny Chinese kid, and he has made some scientific breakthrough. So, you know, I'm patronizing him the way I've been trained to do. And I said, well, how did you learn to sequence genes, you know, instead of swimming? I'm a swimming champion. I remember he said that to me. I have a lot of medals. So he was a well-balanced 11-year-old kid. And these days I understand he's a college professor in Seattle. But in any case, he said, my uncle or my grandfather explained to me that the way you train fleas, he hit a soft part in me because I used to go to Hubert's Flea Circus on 42nd Street and watch fleas draw Roman chariots and swing on trapezes. He said, you've got to break their spirits. If you put fleas in a container, they'll instantly leap off and head off in all directions because they have flea agendas, and even they don't all off in the same direction. They have individual agendas. So he says you gotta break that autonomy in the flea first. And the way you do that is you put them in a container, small, with a lid on. And the fleas keep attempting to follow their own agenda, and they strike themselves over and over again. And if you come back in an hour or so, they're all huddled in a mass together. Now when you take the lid off, they don't even try to escape. Now, he said, you can impose your will on the flea. The minute the 11-year-old kid said that to me, I knew that I had been hired as the lid on the container. Not that I hadn't sabotaged it somewhat, but nevertheless, that's what we all had been hired to do. And this principle was understood. Training fleas was a delight of emperors thousands of years ago. And whoever trained those fleas understood the principle and saw that it could be applied as it is in military training to human beings, as it is in much religious training. Not all, but much.
So you've got a character like Wundt who believes that children have no soul, and he's designing an education system, and then you've got these Machiavellian techniques being layered in on top of it of how to break the will of animals, and it's being used to train our children.
Yeah, what's surprising is that these insights and even these activities that don't depend on modern technology, I mean, these are understood a long time ago. And the only subject at the Roman collegia in the 5th century was, I'll put an umbrella over it, crowd control. You know, how you divide to conquer, what buttons on the human organ you press to produce certain sounds. I mean, that's 16 centuries ago. What has happened in the intervening 16 centuries? They forgot that, or was it added to? Has it become amazingly sophisticated? Less and less people necessary to produce more and more leverage.
Is there a connection between the ideals of someone like Calvin and his espousing a theocratic state and modern states like Israel, which are also built along the same theocratic terms?
I think, and I'm trying to be as fair as possible to the villains in this, I think there's some impulsion in everyone to have certainty, that even as babies we're aware of how many accidents, how much menace is out there, jeopardy, certainty. So to follow a list of rules, algorithms, you know, is emotionally very satisfying. But it doesn't work if everyone's not doing it. You know, and the minute everyone's doing it, you don't have to do it. You now are handed freedom because the menace has been reduced of other people experimenting with humanity, enlarging its boundaries. And then economically, of course, your capital's at risk. If that's the overproduction thing. I hope we talked about that yesterday, because it finally was the tipping point in the late 19th century as corporations were enlarging and layering themselves. Men like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Astor, they were fully aware that human ingenuity was a tremendous risk to capital formation, because to talk people out of their wealth on the grounds that you can multiply it doesn't work. If too many people invent ways to do something better than your investment, the capital's destroyed. So the easiest way to manage the future and the present, of course, they saw a series of financial crises all through history, but especially in the 19th century, where the boot of the master had been lifted off ordinary people, and they were recklessly inventive. I mean, America's producing more inventions than all the rest of the world put together. You can't have that, because on that new base, the next base is going to be frightening. So a term existed and exists, but it's been camouflaged in the 21st century, called overproduction. You have to use government to control overproduction, dumping too many goods or services on the market that it can't absorb. And the easiest way to do that, at first you try licensing, and other kinds of government subsidy to favored groups. But ultimately, the killer app is to remove the ability to be inventive from the ordinary mass. These days it's called overcapacity, because to penetrate what that means is much harder than to see instantly what overproduction means. Then a second menace emerged in the late 19th century, but by the late 1960s, it was clear it too would have to be controlled. That's called hyper-democracy. If too many people take democracy seriously and understand how to form alliances with one another to confront power with power, then power becomes much less effective. So when the kids stopped the Vietnamese War, waves of them, this was so intolerable. The costs to privileged classes of this rain of money, the costs to the government of not being able to suppress dissent on the grounds that this is an emergency. This couldn't be allowed to happen again. The Trilateral Commission gave me the break I needed to understand this more precisely. They underwrote the publication of a book called The Crisis of Democracy in 1975, published by New York University Press, in which now you have to have training in reading between the lines, because the sophisticated power brokers aren't nakedly making these statements. But if you read Crisis of Democracy carefully, you will see that the crisis is too many people took it seriously and translated the principles into action and cost the industries and the hierarchy a war that, now the next war would be harder to run. To get together. It would be more absurd. At least you could make a case in those jungles, but now you're going to have to make a case in the arid deserts of Iraq or in the mountains of Afghanistan why national security depends on suppressing these barefoot people and people whose weapons are blowing up their feet in their underwear. Hey, they're going to take the bread out of your family's mouth. I remember the attempt in Nicaragua under the Sandinistas to communicate the idea that it was just a stone's throw from our southern border, and these people might pile into their 20 and 30-year-old vehicles, and there'd be this 1,000-mile drive north and into Texas they'd come. Well, our economy, of course, cannot function without warfare. So that when these things are over, count on the fact that if we have to attack the South Pole, the penguins are clear and present danger.
In the Paris Peace Conference, 1919, pre-CFR formation, Colonel House and these characters are hanging out, and Ho Chi Minh comes in and says, we want to be free like America, we love democracy, we want to do this, and instead of helping them out, helping them to become free, they're like, well, we're going to have to take them out. That makes a good place to have.
We need enemies. We have to have enemies. The interesting thing about the book, The Crisis of Democracy, is that spreading out like ripples from a stone thrown in a pond, the popular magazines and press, Time magazine did a cover story on too much democracy, ? Of course, they concluded, you bet, in a complicated, high-tech world, you can't allow non-experts to make decisions there. But it was everywhere. So the tom-toms, they're interconnected, and they beat simultaneously or nearly so.
What's the role of curiosity?
Oh, is it not the lever that produces invention? I mean, it forces you really in a fun way to think for yourself there. And then it turns out that the secrets of nature or of society aren't really very hard to penetrate as long as you remain curious. How do you destroy curiosity? Because we all say little babies are always curious. How do you destroy curiosity? Well, one good way is to sit people in chairs, tell them to speak when you're spoken to, threaten them with upcoming tests if they don't memorize usually erroneous material. It's fascinating. Show me a school book that deals with Admiral Perry's opening of Japan. And the school book, last one I looked, was nominally under the aegis of the Librarian of Congress, so a major scholar, and it will say that essentially, it will say that we decided that Japan should be part of the modern world. It wasn't fair to leave them in medieval. And so Admiral Perry sailed over there and negotiated, and they said, okay, you can have coaling bases, or we'll take care of sunken whaler crews. What no one says is that Perry had 11-inch naval rifles, the standard of the day. The Japanese had medieval cannon with a range of about 75 yards, and Perry's guns could reach 10 miles. And that Perry emphasized the destructive impact of his force of 3 black gunboats. I mean, somebody had to actually paint the boats black by destroying some structures on the shore. Then they rowed out fast enough and said, please, massa.
When did the American dream become one of lifelong servitude and debt and slavery?
It's so fascinating that the American dream is enunciated in 1859 by Abraham Lincoln speaking to the Wisconsin Agricultural Associations. That's 152 years ago. And he says the American dream is to write your own script, to have an independent livelihood. That's why we don't have giant corporations like Britain and Germany have. People only work for somebody else long enough to put a stake together, and they figure out what people need, and then they do. So the American dream was, as elementary school books, it was liberty, freedom, personal sovereignty, and it was rather unique in the history of political nations around the earth, or even tribal bodies. And did it work? It almost immediately propelled us into a paramount position among the, just because I'm not hostile to, but I'm also a stranger to IT and the high-tech world. But I do try to keep up with the theory of what's going on. And about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a wonderful analytical book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Are you familiar with it? I don't remember who wrote it at all. And I read it, and I saw almost immediately what I thought nature was about, proving itself through IT. The author or authors maintain that the crowd collectively has more wisdom and insight collectively, and gave some hair-raising examples. A huge gold ore body in Canada was discovered by the company putting its limited, it knew that there had to be an ore body there, but it also knew that if it used the normal procedures and the hole proved dry, excuse the mixed metaphor there, that they would be exhausted and they would have to sell what they knew. It's Gold Corp today, GG on the exchange. So how did they discover the ore body? Instead of going to the recognized engineers and blowing all their wad on one shot, on the internet, they globally put out to anyone at all, from any background at all, they wanted a theory of how to find that ore body. And somebody who had nothing to do with mining, pick up the book, because I'm losing the richness of the details.
But it's the essence of how non-experts can make some of the biggest discoveries.
Oh, well, there is a book. I made a note to bring up here. There's a book that used to be required reading at MIT, and maybe still would be. It's by a middle-level physicist named Robert Scott Root Bernstein. It's called Creativity. It's this thick, and the structure internally is so maddening. It's done in the form of a group discussion among different people, why he did that. But eventually I forced myself to read it, and what just comes pouring out of it is how actual life, world-changing discoveries are made. This is an MIT textbook. Apparently, by adding funds and assistance to a project, you almost destroy your ability to make these breakthroughs. People who have to saw ice cube trays in half to make a piece of lab equipment, etc., are the people who transcend the conventional. Now, that's often then taken over by a big project. One of the most recent dramatic examples, and I'm sure you can Google or whatever the search engine term is, there was 2 or 3 years ago in 60 Minutes, there was an account of a new way to treat cancerous tumors with radiation, without any side effects at all, and it had been discovered by a man in his garage who was had nothing to do with cancer research.
John Canzius is who you're talking about, right?
Who?
John Canzius?
Yes, Canzius.
And he worked in radio and television, and
he was a kid. He was an enthusiast. And he knew that if you shot radio waves through metal, that it heated up, and he wondered if it would kill a tumor, but not leave the devastation that radiation does. And in fact, it did. Now, we don't have to take it on faith. The leading cancer researchers in the world said this is a whole new ball game, and some key research hospitals and took the process over. And Canzius's motivation was he was in the terminal stages of cancer himself, and he knew that the established treatments wouldn't help him. And in fact, he was too far gone and he died. I think the thing is at Pittsburgh now, but it's at some major universities. But I heard the reigning expert in the world say this makes all the past, irrelevant. But that's a commonality. I copied some notes out of the Ruth Bernstein book. He said that intensive and narrow scientific training will guarantee that you never make a scientific breakthrough. You can get the best Johns Hopkins, it doesn't matter. It's the narrowness of training. The people who make these breakthroughs have as wide a range of mental and physical tools as possible. They almost invariably play musical instruments, are good at languages, etc., etc. Most successful people in physics make it by going off by themselves and learning whatever they want to, not following the history of the physical sciences. What they learn from mentors is how to deal with ambiguity. But the established bodies of scientific knowledge get in the way of thinking afresh. As soon as you hear these things, they're so commonsensical, you say, of course, why didn't I think of that? Just a couple more here. Virtually every scientific pioneer, men like Edison, Franklin, Einstein, Planck, Maxwell, many others, had early opportunities to do absolutely independent research. All of them were in their early 20s, which has given rise to an understanding in the higher levels of the sciences that if you haven't made a major breakthrough by your middle 20s, you're not going to. What you can do is head up a project and be a bureaucrat and take credit, as many college professors do, for the discoveries of your students, but you're not going to be worth gambling on. It isn't the age in itself that limits insight. It's the imprint of rigid patterns of habits. Now, I happen to dig up a wonderful quote from William James Psychology, I think printed in 1890, and the book given credit for establishing psychology as an academic subject. And James was, of course, he had ambivalent feelings, but he certainly was a disciple of Wundt there. Now, this is a direct quote from William James Psychology 121 years ago. Habit is the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious agent. It alone saves the children of fortune from the envious uprisings of the poor. It alone prevents the most repulsive jobs from being deserted. It holds the miner in his darkness. It keeps different social strata from mixing. Well, I'll just complete. One of the insights of discovering that really electrified me as I was reading it is how frequently the great discovery in the scientific arena is not made by the specialists in that area, by somebody from another area completely divorced who transfers into chemistry or physics, has fresh eyes, cuts through the habits that lock the mind in place, and makes the discovery. Says freedom and flexibility is much more valuable than planning. Insight comes only by getting out of ruts and plugging into a variety of methods. So these great truths, it isn't that we're discovering them now. We're taking them out of their burial places and saying, hey, look, wake up. You know, the world is much bigger and much different than you believe it is because you've been conditioned to believe it's that way. I have something here. I have the 6 purposes of schooling as laid down in 1917 by the man who Harvard named their honor lecturer in education for. So far from being a fringe individual, this guy is the reason the Harvard honor lecture in education is named as it is. The Ingalls lecture. Looks like Inglis, but it's pronounced Ingalls. And I would like to read you the 6 purposes of schooling. I moved heaven and earth, and it took years to find this book, just like trying to find, in past years, a copy of Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. I learned about Ingalls from the 20-year president of Harvard, James Bryan Conant, who was a poison gas specialist in World War I, was a very inner circle of the atomic bomb project, World War II, was the High Commissioner of occupied Germany after the war. So he wrote, there must be 20 books about the institution of schooling, of which he was completely a proponent. And he's a very, very bad writer. I forced myself to read most of these books, and in one of them, he says that if you really want to know what school is about, you need to pick up the book that I'm referring to here, Principles of Secondary Education. 2 years it took me to find a copy of the book, 750 pages, tiny print, and as dull as your imagination can conceive. And furthermore, it's not until you get to the very middle of the book, in an unlabeled section, that he spills the beans. Let me spill them for you. These are the 6 purposes or functions, as he calls them. The first he calls the adjustive function. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. That's their main purpose, habits of reaction to authority. That's why school authorities don't tear their hair out when somebody exposes that that the atomic bomb wasn't dropped on Korea as a history book in 1990s, printed by Scott Forsman, distributed, and why each of these books has hundreds of substantive errors. Learning isn't the reason the texts are distributed. So first is the adjustive function, fixed habits. Now, here comes the wonderful insight that being able to analyze the detail will give you. How can you establish whether someone has successfully developed this automatic reaction? Because people have a proclivity when they're given sensible orders to follow it. That's not what they want to reach. The only way you can measure this is to give stupid orders and people automatically follow those. Now you've achieved function 1. Have you ever wondered why some of the foolish things schools do are allowed to continue? Number 2, he calls it the integrating function, but it's easier to understand if you call it the conformity function. It's to make children as alike as possible, the gifted children and the stupid as alike as possible, because market research uses statistical sampling, and it only works if people react generally the same way. The third function he calls the directive function. School is to diagnose your proper social role and then to log the evidence that here's where you are in the Great Pyramid, so that future people won't allow you to escape that compartment. The fourth function is the differentiating function, because once you've diagnosed kids in this layer, you do not want them to learn anything that the higher layers are learning. So you teach just as far as the requirements of that layer. Number 5 and 6 are the creepiest of all. Number 5 is the selective function. What that means is what Darwin meant by natural selection. You're assessing the breeding quality of each individual kid. You're doing it structurally because school teachers don't know this is happening. And you're trying to use ways to prevent the poorer stuff from breeding. And those ways are hanging labels, humiliating labels around their neck, encouraging the shallowness of thinking, you know. I often wondered, because I came from a very, very strict Scotch-Irish culture that never allowed you to leer at a girl. Well, when I got to New York City, the boys were pawing the girls openly, and there was really no redress for the girls at all, except not showing up in the classroom. You know, high absentee rates. Well, you're supposed to teach structurally that sexual pleasure is what you withdraw from a relationship, and everything else a waste of time and expensive. So the selective function is what Darwin meant by the favored races. The idea is to consciously improve the breeding stock. Schools are meant to tag the unfit with their inferiority by poor grades, remedial placement, humiliation, so that their peers will accept them as inferior. And the good breeding stock among the females will reject them as possible partners. And the sixth is the creepiest of all, and I think it's partly what Tragedy and Hope is about. It's a fancy Roman name, the propaidutic function. Because as early as Roman big-time thinkers, it was understood that to continue a social form required some people being trained that they were the custodians of this. So some small fraction of the kids are being ready to take over the project. That's the guy, the honor lecture, and it will not surprise you that his ancestors include the major general at the siege of Lucknow in India, famous for tying the mutineers on the muzzles of the cannons and blowing them apart, or somebody who was forced to flee New York City, a churchman, because at the beginning of the American Revolution, because he wrote a refutation of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. They were going to tar and feather him. He fled and was rewarded by the British by making him the Bishop of Nova Scotia. Those are Ingalls' ancestors. So Al Ingalls is certainly, when I learned of this and wrote to Harvard asking for access to the Ingalls lecture, strike me dead, Lord, if I'm exaggerating at all, I was told, well, there is no Ingalls lecture, hasn't been for years, and we have no records. It was the same thing that happened when I discovered that Elwood P. Coverley, the most influential schoolman of the 20th century and the bionomics genius, had been the elementary school editor of Houghton Mifflin. And I wrote Houghton Mifflin, is there any records? And they said, we have no record of anyone named Elwood P. Coverley. Now Harvard's telling me there's no Ingalls lecture. A week passed, and I got a call from Harvard, from some obscure office at Harvard, saying, what is your interest in the Ingalls lecture? I knew that I was on thin ice. And I said, well, James Conant referred me in his books to the man the Ingalls lecture is named after. And I was wondering if I could get some background on this fellow and a list of the lectures. And in due time, I got a list of the lectures and instructions how to access the texts, but not easily. Enough hoops that someone who has to mow the lawn and burp the baby, wouldn't jump through those hoops. I was able to prove Harper's wouldn't publish when they did the cover essay I wrote, which Lou Latham named Against School, probably after Jeremiah's Against. But I had called the artificial extension of childhood, because I think that's the key mechanism at work here. So they wouldn't print the information about Coverley because Houghton Mifflin denied it. It was only months afterward that I looked through my extensive library of incredibly dull books about schooling and opened, and the facing page said Elwood Coverley, editor-in-chief, elementary school, publishing arm of Houghton Mifflin. By the way, the secondary editor-in-chief was Alexander Ingalls. So you see how this cousinage, the incest, works.
If Martin Luther's idea was to cut out the middleman, and teachers read books. Why can't students just read books instead of going to the middleman for their information?
Well, the more highly placed the schooling is, the more likely it is that they do that. They go to primary documents. They understand how suspicious all secondary documents are. Not that they aren't useful, but to give the writer or the editorial staff the ability to shift the information. That's why in the reprints of Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, we really need some of you out there to sit with the original and sit with the reprint and make sure that key things aren't eluded on perfectly reasonable grounds that, we want to shrink this down from 1,300 pages to 1,000 or whatever. Oh, it was an oversight.
We have 9 minutes left. I have 2 questions, and then we can do an informal book signing and get you out of here. What time?
Yeah, well, you should want to know what happens to an ordinary class of 13-year-olds when they get a smattering of that. I mean, as much as they can absorb in a short time. Well, many of you will have seen Strawberry Fields, the monument to the Beatles in Central Park. I don't want to pat myself on the back because I didn't much care for the Beatles and I hate using parkland for it. But I was approached by 3 girls, 2 of them here, bitterly complaining that the Community Planning Board had denied Yoko Ono's petition to build Strawberry Fields. And they were furious that this had been done. And I said, well, you don't have to accept their decision. They're the lowest part of the pecking order. First, according to protocol, you have to take your case to them. So we'll book you an appointment, and you lay down the reasons you want to take 3 acres of Central Park and give it to this group who could only play 3 musical chords. But I told them, whatever you want to do, including building a pistol, I'll show you how you can learn how to do that. I won't censor. So it had been voted down 45-8 by the Community Planning Board, and the Community Planning Board unanimously rejected their appeal. I said, now you want to look who has to sign off on their decision. This is not a group of local big shots. This is the Landmarks Preservation Commission. You don't get on that unless your ancestors come over on the Mayflower or you have $10 billion. I said, this is the elite of the elite. And now what you want to do is research. The names are publicly accessible. 23 of them, and I'll bet 4 or 5 of them would already be in favor of this thing. All you need is 12 of them to reject this for it to happen. So you find out who these people are and get as much biographical information. IT has made this on these people, and you will find the buttons to play them like a noble organ. You can find out what causes they became noteworthy for, etc., etc. And now what you're going to do, because there's 12,000 kids in this school district, is I'm going to free you from school for a month, and you're going to split up. You go from school to school, find troublemakers, and get petitions. Because what we need, because your letterhead will say committee of 5,000. We need 5,000 signatures on a petition, and you're going to write an individual letter writing campaign to each of the 23 members of the Community Planning Board, asking them to please immortalize this group. Well, I get a phone call in the front office from someone out of class. I was 6 weeks later. And the voice on the phone says, "Hello, this is Yoko Ono." And I thought it was one of my cockamamie friends. I said, "This is George Washington, Yoko. What's on your mind?" Fortunately, she didn't take umbrage. Maybe didn't even hear me saying it. She said, "The decision has been reversed. I want to hold a party at the Dakota for these girls. Could they be released from school?" Well, I don't know, Yoko. I'm going to miss a lot. So, that's one. Look at this one. Here's a 12-year-old C student from, he lived in Hong Kong. He was a C student, but he was a polite young fellow. He was going nowhere there, and he had the effrontery to go to a pizza parlor in an all-white Upper West Side in 1980. And the owner of the parlor, a 6'6" crazy Greek who happened to be a friend of mine, took his pizza, took his soda, threw them away. The charge was he had taken 2 straws. You only let 1 straw, right? So he comes over ranting about racial prejudice. I said it was the wrong thing to do, and I'm going to show you how to deal with it. But I don't think it was racial prejudice. His clientele at lunch comes from the collegiate school. They wear blue blazers, gold buttons. John F. Kennedy's kid went there. They leave big tips for his staff. And he knows the public school kids, black or white, go in there for lunch, he's going to lose that blue ribbon trade. Nevertheless, you're going to give him a chance to back down. This is an absolutely massive, insane Greek who believes violence is the solution to all problems. Once Jerry Mulligan, the famous jazz saxophonist, bounced a $10 check. He had it blown up to billboard size and mounted outside the restaurant. Okay, so I said, you go to the phone and I'll listen. And you say, "I'm the guy whose pizza you took, but I'm willing to let bygones be bygones," if I could. Nick hangs up on him. I said, "I'm going to give you what in law is called an affidavit, that you attempted to solve this problem peaceably." Now, I said, you want to go over there in person tomorrow, and I'll provide a long-distance witness, and you want to say, "Look, it's just a slice of pizza. Give me my slice of pizza back." But Nick had the bit between out the kid goes. And now I said, you're going to call him one more time with a different teacher as a witness. Then you're going to write him a letter, certified, return receipt requested, 65 cents in those days. And now you have 4 pieces of evidence to provide to the court. And then you're going to sue his ass in small claims court. Only cost like $3 in those days. But it was 17 miles from the school. Kids can't sue. I said, anyone with $3 can sue. That doesn't mean you're going to win. But the way the referee in small claims court decides, since it's one person's, is who has evidence that they acted reasonably. And you will have 4 pieces of evidence, and this guy will be steam coming out of his ears. Well, he was awarded triple damages. How about that? Now, what do you suppose the small claims court referee said when he got home that night to his friend? "You're not going to believe what I just adjudicated." So beginning about 4 days later, we get a call from the Brooklyn College Law School. Could he come over and lecture? Of course, he said no, and I said, "Listen, I'll ruin you if you don't. We'll work it out." Then Columbia Law School called. Then we got daily calls from judges to take him out to lunch, because isn't this a symbol that the system really, okay. He's the only kid in 30 years of teaching that took my advice not to waste your time in high school. I said, any number of very good colleges will take you in at the end of your sophomore year if you provide the documentation. You're ready. He went to Duke, full tuition scholarship, then Duke University Law School, and by the way, these two events, Strawberry Fields and Pizza Palace Soon, are from the same term in a junior high school. Just a few more of these things. Here's a PhD from UCal. Here's a 13-year-old girl who came to me complaining that her mother was a liar, said she could go to Paris alone that summer if she could raise the money. She said, I just checked and nobody. I mean, she was a single-parent household. Mother was a secretary. She said, nobody. I said, well, you can't do it on a job, but there's not very much money if you have a little business. And she said, 13-year-old kids can't have businesses. I said, if you have something people want, they don't care how old you are. I mean, Sean Fanning almost ruined the music business with Napster. He was 17. So she takes a week out of school, figures out a really interesting exotic business that you can read my book and find out what it was, and raises enough money in a short time by cutting school for 6 consecutive weeks that she could afford to pay her mother's way to Paris. She came and said, I've got much more money than I need. I said, why don't you take your mother to Paris? She might appreciate it. On the basis of that, she went to what I believe is the finest college in the United States, Hampshire College, where you write your own curriculum and then you negotiate with the faculty. My granddaughter goes there, will be graduating next year. Hello, Christina. That's all I'll say. So,
what phrase in Icelandic means writing of God?
Yes. Well, her real name was, it's carried popularly as Gudrun, but she wasn't satisfied, so she went to court and changed it to Christina. So, hey, what are you going to do?
If you could say something that would echo through time and each and every person from now until the end of humanity would hear it.
Yeah. Sensible children do not wish to be incomplete human beings. And so when you impose a stage theory of human development upon them, you affect or tormenting them, you're limiting their opportunity. The whole world for all history knew that childhood is over about the age of 7, and if it persists beyond the age of 12, you've got some hopeless human being on your mind. Don't be your kid's enemy because they're not a kid. That's a fellow human being, male or female. Be their partner and enlarge the opportunities. No homework, please.
What does a college education really get you in the 21st century?
I think it's consistently given less and less. It essentially was the last hoop to jump through, but it never delivered much to most of the people who jumped through that hoop. It is possible, if you understand that an education is something you have to take, to use the resources that are assembled there and actually stitch together an education for yourself and get some value. But most people, of course, follow a prescribed plan which has been put together by a committee somewhere. And in fact, doesn't do much for most people. I went to Cornell, Columbia, and Reed College, and I can guarantee from Cornell and Columbia, I remember nothing except the babes, the alcohol, hangovers, etc. From Reed, I got a little bit out of a Plato seminar that I do remember, basically arguing with the professor who encouraged that. You know, it doesn't give you bang for your buck unless you commit, which who does? Isn't it supposed to produce a certificate that certifies you as eligible? The funny thing is that IT has accidentally exploded a lot of that because so many people. I remember when my daughter graduated from MIT, and she used to bitterly complain that her classmates would vanish for months at a time doing jobs for various companies, then come back as if nothing had happened and nobody punished them. You know, sorry to say that we were so slow picking up on you judge people by performance, not by credentials. And real people, you'd be insane to hire on the basis of credentials, because the skew between memory and application is so large that eventually you're top heavy with people who don't know how to do anything much.
I'm going to ask this last question. I'm going to go burn your DVD, if that way you're not late. And so just answer to Jitu and Tony and Kevin. What is the value of persistence as juxtaposed to the learning process?
About 10 years ago, I helped to set up a foundation that at Edison High School in New Jersey awards $10,000 a year to the most persistent student in the class. And persistence in the face of adversity is the final test. If you can stick to something, nothing is difficult to learn. I mean, nothing at all. But the natural selection process, operating on a low boredom quotient, on personal disrespect, I can't do that, and many other things, eliminates almost everyone except the persistent. Those are the ones who demonstrate merit. Now, obviously, a lot of the control mechanism is inherited or appointed, but the parts that aren't go to the persistent. And that includes the arts and the sciences as well as politics. I mean, who could imagine, for example, that an obviously inferior human being, I'm not speaking politically here, like George W. Bush, could pass through all the screens on the way up and then be elected not once but twice by the American population. He flunked his pilot's course 25 out of 100, and now he's supposed to be given a jet to fly in combat. But of course,
all right, folks, that's it for today. We're going to go into the tune-out thingy soon. So I'd like to thank everybody in the chat. Captain, Dan, Desert, Jax, Joe, and Jules, Mrs. C, Gypsy, Top Knot, Vincent, Easley, The Greaser, and Fornons. Thanks for listening, everybody. There's 20 or so minutes left from that interview. You can Google it, John Taylor Gatto, The Ultimate History Lesson. You'll get there, John Taylor Gatto, The Ultimate History Lesson. So thanks a lot, everybody. Listen to what Huxley says in this outro, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.